The morning air over Normandy was heavy, unmoving. Dew clung to the hedgerows, and a thin mist settled into the shallow folds of the land. To the trained ear, the battlefield was never truly silent, but this morning felt different, too quiet, too expectant. A German artillery officer stood beside his map table, watch in hand. He had learned long ago that survival on the modern battlefield depended not on bravery, but on understanding rhythm. Every barrage, no matter how fierce, had a beginning and an end. Shells came in waves, bombs fell in patterns. If you could read the pattern, you could endure. He had endured before. Russia, Italy, earlier fighting in Normandy. British fire plans, American probing attacks, all loud, all violent, all survivable if timed correctly. He listened now not to explosions, but to engines. A low, distant hum, then another and another. He checked his watch. For years, German artillery doctrine had emphasized calculation and control. Officers were trained to observe enemy fire, note intervals, count seconds between impacts. A barrage was a problem to be solved. Men were taught when to crouch, when to move, when to reposition guns during lulls. The officer had taught this doctrine himself. All fire pauses, he used to say. Even the enemy must breathe. Earlier Allied attacks confirmed it. American artillery was powerful but predictable. Airstrikes were frightening but brief. Survive the storm, and the ground battle would follow, where experience and discipline still mattered. That belief had kept him alive. But this morning, as the hum in the sky multiplied, something felt wrong. There was no single direction. The sound came from everywhere. At 09:38, the sky began to disappear. U.S. heavy bombers, hundreds of them, rolled overhead in long, deliberate formations. They did not dive or strafe. They advanced with mechanical patience, indifferent to ground fire that could barely reach them. Then the first bombs fell. Not scattered, not selective, saturation. The ground convulsed as if struck by a giant hammer. Shock waves raced through the soil, lifting men off their feet. The hedgerows, those ancient earthen walls, simply collapsed. Trees snapped, guns flipped, radios went dead in an instant. The officer pressed himself into the earth, instinctively counting. 1, 2, 3. There was no fourth. The next wave arrived before the dust from the first had settled, then another and another. This was not an attack, it was erasure. The bombing did not seek targets, it removed terrain. Entire grid squares vanished beneath overlapping explosions. Trenches ceased to exist. Roads turned into craters. Command posts, painstakingly concealed, were revealed only by their destruction. And still the bombs came. As the officer tried to rise, artillery joined the storm. American guns, mass-fired and coordinated, began to land shells into the same shattered zones. There was no sequence, no air phase followed by ground fire. Everything happened at once. This was the moment timing failed. He raised his head and tried again to calculate. 5 seconds between impacts? No. 3. No. 2 overlapping waves. He waited for the pause that never came. The watch in his hand had become meaningless. Nearby, a gun crew abandoned their piece, not because it was damaged, but because the men no longer understood when to move. Orders could not be shouted over the noise. Runners vanished into smoke and never returned. A lieutenant screamed for men to follow him. No one did. This was not fear in the traditional sense. It was disorientation. The human mind requires gaps, moments to act, to decide. Operation Cobra allowed none. The battlefield no longer belonged to time. Survivors later described it. They spoke of pressure rather than sound, of the air being pushed away from their lungs, of the earth rolling beneath them like water. The officer realized something then, quietly, with terrible clarity. This was not fire meant to suppress, it was fire meant to replace the battlefield. American doctrine had reached its full expression. Factories thousands of kilometers away had become weapons. Oil refineries, railroads, shipyards, all feeding this single moment. Bombers did not worry about accuracy the way German artillery once had. Accuracy no longer mattered when volume achieved certainty. Where German doctrine relied on precision and skill, American doctrine relied.
Enough bombs and resistance became theoretical. The officer crawled through debris that had once been a command trench. A radio lay cracked open, wires exposed like veins. His map, so carefully prepared, was useless now. Landmarks no longer existed. He tried to issue an order. His voice vanished into the noise. Around him, soldiers had stopped reacting to commands. They moved only when forced by explosions. Rank had dissolved, structure had evaporated. This was the true breaking point, not when men ran, but when leadership ceased to function. For years, German officers believed wars were decided by maneuver, by counterattack, by nerve. Operation Cobra revealed a different truth. Wars could be decided by systems. American firepower did not ask who held the ground, it simply reclaimed it. Infantry would follow later, not to fight, but to occupy what had already been destroyed. The officer understood now why resistance felt pointless. There was nothing left to resist with. When the bombing finally lifted, the silence was unnatural. Ears rang. Smoke drifted across a landscape stripped of shape. The officer stood slowly, surveying what remained. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a demonstration. He did not think of defeat in terms of honor or shame. He thought of arithmetic. No army, no matter how experienced, could withstand an enemy that turned industry into momentum. The war had passed a threshold. And standing there, amid the ruins of Normandy, a German artillery officer understood something many would only realize later. The battlefield no longer belonged to soldiers. It belonged to American firepower.